Thanks so much for joining us this evening. We've got a jam-packed hour ahead of us with a lot of content to cover with regards to the welfare implications of the captive industry. And this evening, we have Dr. Louise de Waal joining us from Blood Lions as the campaign manager. We have Christine joining us as a wildlife veterinarian, and Karen Trendler is joining us again. She is from Working Wild and is a wildlife welfare expert. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar, ladies.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Right, so for a bit of context, what this webinar is going to be all about. About 2 weeks ago, we held a webinar regarding unpacking the MTT report, and we realized that there were so many concerns regarding wildlife welfare in commercial captive facilities. So that's why we've decided we're actually going to do another webinar that specifically addresses these welfare concerns. So for a bit of background, in 2022, Blood Lions and World Animal Protection reviewed about 90 scientific papers and released a peer-reviewed welfare paper that identified 170 physical and psychological conditions associated with keeping lions in captivity. Now, some of these welfare challenges included a range of diseases, physical injuries, malnutrition, obesity, a lack of clean water, abnormal behaviors such as excessive pacing and self-mutilation. These studies were focused on lions in zoos, wildlife parks, and sanctuaries across the globe. None of the 90 reviewed papers were focused on animals involved in South Africa's commercial captive predator industry, where the emphasis, is on intensive breeding practices that are primarily consumer-driven and income generation focused, and generally don't adequately address animal welfare and well-being. And this is where lions are more likely to face a far greater welfare challenge. In addition to this, South Africa has no national welfare norms and standards on the keeping, breeding, and trade of lions and other predators in captivity. And this puts the existing big cats in captivity at even more risk of serious welfare issues. So I want us to start discussing general welfare challenges that we see in the commercial captive lion industry. So welfare issues are one of the main reasons why we have reached this point of advocating to phase out the commercial captive predator industry. So let's unpack what the experts have been experiencing on the ground. We recently conducted a radio interview, Louise and myself, in which industry players claimed that the welfare issues of captive predators are only a few rotten apples, really. But is this actually the case? So Karen, I would like to start with you here. What are the specific welfare issues that you have been experiencing on the ground for the many years that you've been working as a welfare specialist?
We're seeing some very, very basic husbandry issues. So an absence of the 5 freedoms, lack of hygiene, dietary issues, dirty water, no shelter for the lion, a total lack of enrichment, so they're bored, malnourished. So we see very underweight, malnourished lions and some obese animals. Because of the hygiene issues and the poor husbandry, there is poor immunity, so you see a lot of secondary infections and internal and external parasites. And then on the more chronic long-term issues related to poor hygiene, related to poor diet, lack of exercise, we see a lot of musculoskeletal issues. So sway back, ballet feet where the front feet deviate and turn outwards, the slightly squashed faces. So there are a lot of acute and chronic health issues that we're seeing in the captive industry.
Thank you for that. And I think the images also address a lot of what you're seeing there. Is there anything in these images that you would specifically like to address?
Well, I think if we hand over to Christine as the vet on this one, it would be a good idea. I can talk for the whole hour on this, but let's let Christine jump in as the veterinarian.
Christine, what about this photo now with the white lioness? Is there anything that you're seeing there of concern?
Yeah, I mean, here you could, what is of concern is, yeah, you can definitely see, you know, obviously the hair loss. And then it's also very clear how obese that lioness actually is. So with like the folds on the side, and you can see her size. Same in one of the previous pictures. Hair loss can have various reasons. In this case, it could easily be due to external parasites, which is, you know, commonly seen. Yeah. In other things, I mean, Karen has mentioned some of those already. In younger animals, parasites, infections are commonly seen, but also conditions which one can pinpoint to inadequate nutrition or inadequate, you know, husbandry and keeping, be it because they didn't get enough supplements or yeah, any of those basically.
Thank you, Christine. And Karen, I wonder if we could come back to you for a second and I wanted to know, are these welfare issues that we're seeing in these images a recent problem, or is this something that's existed for some time in the commercial industry?
I wish I could say it was a very recent issue, but as far back as 2002, when I got my first collapsed lion cubs from the industry, we've been seeing welfare issues. And as the industry has grown and as the competition has grown and as it's become increasingly commercially driven, we've seen increasing welfare issues. It's also an industry that's in flux and that has faced a lot of uncertainty. COVID certainly had an impact. You know, all of the debates, the high-level panel, the parliamentary colloquium, the international opposition to trophy hunting, especially to canned and to the hunting of captive bred animals, has all had an impact. So unfortunately, we are seeing increasing welfare issues in the industry. It's certainly long-term and it is increasing.
Thank you. Louise, I'd like to come to you now and ask your opinion. What are some of the reasons why we're experiencing so many welfare issues within this industry?
Yeah, I think one of the things that Karen just mentioned as well is the profit-driven aspect of the industry. So in a profit-driven industry, you're trying to keep your margins as small as possible. So nutrition, food is something that people save on. So they might not get the right meats. They might not get the supplements that they need because they're expensive. And when there is an issue like this lioness with that might be mange on her nose, they don't get the treatment because veterinarians are costly people to consult. So definitely, sorry, Christine, but you know, we know that when you take your cat to the vet, it's actually more expensive than when you go to the doctor yourself. But yeah, it is that profit-driven aspect for sure that is creating a lot of these issues. And I think there's also the way that this industry has developed, and this whole life cycle of lions as well. And we as Blood Lions, we've spoken about this a lot, in which, you know, at every stage of the lion's life, they are going to find a way of actually making money. So the younger cubs are taken away from the mother. This will put the mother back into estrus much quicker, so she can get pregnant again. She can maybe have 4 litters compared to 1 litter in the wild in 2 years, which has health issues in its own right for the mother. but also health issues for the cubs being taken away. There then, you know, the food aspect, the lack of nutrition. We don't have the official legal bone trade, but there were quite a lot of animals that were purely bred for the bone trade. And if the end product is the bones, then you're not going to care much how those animals look like on the outside. So yeah, I think it's that the whole structure of the industry, and it's a commercial industry, it's an industry for profit.
Sure. And I think it's also worth noting at this point that the images that we have shown so far, with the obese lion, the mange, the lack of enrichment, the lack of decent shelter, none of these images were taken at facilities that are outside of the public eye. These images all come from commercial facilities that are geared towards visiting tourists. So these are all very, very public, and you know, the tourists and visitors will see the conditions that these animals live in. And I think that's just a very important point to make from the very beginning, and we'll keep circling back to it. Christine, I'd like to come back to you now and ask, what are the most common health-related issues in captive lions that you see? And how does the commercial keeping and breeding of these animals exacerbate their state of health?
Okay, so I think one has to differentiate a little bit between like older animals and younger animals, and conditions, or you know, chronic conditions. So in the older animals we see lots of chronic kidney disease, cancer, and old age problems. So that would be, you know, almost normal to be expected.
Sure.
But a lot of, especially when it comes to like the musculoskeletal problems, or arthritis, gait changes, any of those can also have, like, there's a couple of factors from the animal's past, you know, as we've mentioned earlier, with the nutrition, the lack of movement. A lot of them we see hypervitaminosis A problems, meaning, for example, they didn't get enough vitamin A when they were young, therefore their skull doesn't develop appropriately, the brain is compressed, you see stargazing, you see gait problems, ataxias, any of those. And in younger animals, you're much more likely to see infections, parasites, also because their immune system didn't develop properly. If they were taken away from the mother in an early age, they didn't actually get this chance, which normally, you know, would happen gradually, but then they were taken away very young. So yeah, taking that away from them.
And I think that speaks to the graphic we just saw now with the tiger cub being fed from a bottle, that in all likelihood that tiger is not going to receive adequate nutrition from milk substitutes, essentially. Is that right?
Definitely. And also considering that normally they would, you know, they would eat their mother's milk, meaning the mother has antibodies, giving it to the cub, which you can't. How are you going to supplement that even?
Yes, thank you. I would like to move on now to having a closer look at some of the MTT protocols. Now, both Louise and Christine are ex-MTT members, so they have had extensive experience with this process, and I would really like to lean on the both of you to just help us better understand what these protocols are going to entail. So, like I said earlier, a couple of weeks ago, we already had a webinar panel, and we specifically looked at unpacking this recently published report. And the report includes not only various voluntary exit options, but also various protocols relating to the keeping and breeding of captive lions. And in particular, we're going to be looking at euthanasia, carcass disposal, transport, population control, and keeping best practices for lions in captivity. So Louise, I'd like to start with you then. Why did the MTT focus so much time on developing these protocols?
That's a really good question. I think we need to take a couple of step backs for that as well.
Sure.
As an MTT, we we felt it was really important to recognize that we are dealing with sentient beings. And although animal sentience has not been recognized in our legislation in South Africa, our courts have acknowledged animal sentience in lots of court cases. Secondly, animal well-being is now a clause within NEMBA, and therefore the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment have a mandate for animal well-being. And on top of that, as you mentioned very early on, is that we don't have national norms and standards for the keeping of lions in captivity that may actually that may work in the favor of their welfare. So there's a lot of sort of elements that led to the fact that we need to really make sure that the welfare and the well-being of these animals, these lions that were going to be part of the voluntary exit process, were being considered properly. And I think, in addition, I should also mention, we don't have national norms and standards, although the industry has come up with some voluntary standards. So SAPA, for example, developed some voluntary norms and standards. However, when we look at the number of people that are a member of SAPA, you might, and they're still voluntary, you may only be looking at maybe 10% of the whole industry. And how can you actually enforce voluntary standards? And then the industry has obviously also looked at self-regulation, which also doesn't work. We can, you know, so there was a lot of sort of consideration and facts that led to this point where, as a team, we had to say, okay, we don't have norms and standards. This industry is just, you know, from welfare perspective, yes, there is an Animal Protection Act that they have to adhere to, but other than that, everybody is kind of doing what they seem right or not. And we have to make sure that we come up with a set of protocols that can be used at least for the voluntary exit, if not for a longer term.
Thank you. And specifically now looking at the euthanasia protocol, in the voluntary exit, as well as in the long-term closure of the industry, we can expect that some lions are going to be humanely euthanized. So we need to make sure that this is carried out in the most ethical way possible. Christine, I'd like to turn to you now about the euthanasia protocol. What is involved to humanely euthanize a lion according to this MTT protocol?
Okay. So I think firstly, there's, you know, you have your general requirements for euthanasia. So euthanasia has to be reliable, irreversible, and quickly induce like the loss of consciousness. But it should also cause the least possible pain, stress, and fear for the animal. And in the case of, you know, any animal, but like lions in the pride, other animals should also be considered. You shouldn't be doing this while the other ones are watching.
Sure.
So when it comes to the method, the lions should be immobilized and anesthetized with, you know, species appropriate drugs. Only once the animal is like really recumbent, approachable, then one places an IV catheter, intravenous catheter, and then administers the euthapen or euthasol. It's a barbituratic acid derivative. That obviously has to go according to the animal's weight. And this should be done by a licensed veterinarian, not by anyone.
Absolutely.
Then, yeah, as I said before, like it has to, you know, there should be like a rapid loss of consciousness. Then follows cardiorespiratory arrest and loss of brain function. And you also have to certify the animal as dead. Like, it's important to check for reflexes and that there's no heartbeat or respiratory anymore.
And this is a
So I think
painless
that's,
process.
yeah.
Yeah. And now, in comparison, I think it's important to remember that whilst the idea of euthanizing lions in the phase-out process might seem like quite a sad state of affairs for many people, this is a humane and painless process. Whereas in comparison, Karen, I'd like to turn to you now to talk about the alternative that is often the case for these lions. What have you experienced in terms of the way lions are slaughtered for their bones, parts, and derivatives? Oh, Karen, you're on mute.
Here I am chatting away, telling you all important things, and I'm on mute. I'll repeat. My apologies. You really think by now that we would know how to unmute. Okay, on the more serious side, as Louise mentioned, there are no norms and standards and no regulations in place for the slaughter of lion for bones. This is an industry that has seen various trends and changes. So initially, the bones were a byproduct of hunting, and there was a trade, an export of that every year. Then there were changes in the industry and changes in demand, and a quota was issued, and we began to see lions being slaughtered and bred for bone purposes only. And in the absence of the regulations and norms and standards for the slaughter process, we were seeing some pretty horrific incidents. For example, the skull, if an intact skull has a higher value than a skull that is damaged, and an intact skeleton where there is no damage to the bones and the parts has a higher value. So there were some horrific practices where they were being shot through the ear or through the eye. And then, the whole process, it's not just the actual killing of the animal, but it was the keeping in the crates for prolonged periods. It was the handling up until the actual killing of the animal. But again, we're seeing changes and trends in this industry where the bones are a byproduct. The bones were then being dug up. There is stockpiling of bones. So it's an industry that's dynamic, but there definitely need to be norms and standards. And there are obviously concerns that by trading in bone, there may be an increase in demand. What are the bones used for? Some of the intact skeletons are used to make lion bone or tiger bone wine, or various health potions. Parts of the bone are used for making jewelry and other artifacts. And then also all the bits and the pieces and the skin and the other bits that remain, or any damaged bones, may then be boiled up, and a sort of black tarry substance that looks like a cake of black soap called tiger cake is also produced. So the slaughter for bones and the whole process around that has been an element of concern for us.
Certainly, the welfare concerns there are enormous compared to humane euthanasia.
Yeah, I mean, there's a world of difference, and I think, for any of us who are welfare orientated or animal orientated or conservation orientated and love wildlife, the thought of euthanizing an animal is a very difficult one.
Absolutely.
But having looked at some of the MTT protocols, it is not just the healthy animals and, to be done willy-nilly. They're going to do a very careful evaluation so that animals that are suffering, animals that have chronic health issues, animals that don't have, a good quality of life will be the ones that will be humanely euthanized. And then we also need to keep in mind that this is an industry that is breeding animals for hunting and breeding animals for product. And so it's not as though they're living out their lives forever. So the euthanasia, in some cases, is a more humane option.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And that actually leads me to my next question for Louise. Karen touched on that quickly now with regards to hunting. What other ways are we seeing lions being utilized and killed in this industry?
Yeah, I think I would like to come back to that in a minute and just carry on from where Karen left off for a minute, is that Christine obviously described a much more humane way of ending an animal's life, the way that it should be done, which is as painless and as stressless as possible. But one of the things that we developed as an MTT as part of that is what we call a quality of life assessment that goes and assesses each animal based on a wide range of physical, physiological, and mental conditions. And as Karen said, it's not like you're then willy-nilly going to decide, okay, this animal needs to be humanely euthanized. It's based on an assessment. Again, that should be carried out by either a qualified welfare expert or a veterinarian. So yeah, with that whole euthanasia protocol, that is part of it, that whole quality of life assessments. And as we've been saying, you know, this is an industry that breeds animals to eventually be killed, and obviously one of the ways and the very, I guess, why this industry was developed is for the captive, or colloquially speaking, the canned hunting, where these often habituated, sometimes hand-reared lions that have always been reliant on people for everything, you know, from their food to their shelter to their water, everything. They've been dependent on people, and then they're being put in confined spaces with no means of escape to be shot. And those hunters are not always the most experienced shots either. So they may not be killed with one bullet either. So yeah, again, welfare issues involved with those kind of hunts.
Yeah, we've certainly seen lots of footage in which it's taken multiple rounds in order to bring an animal down. Absolutely. Sometimes just too horrific to actually think about. But I'd like to move on to the transport protocol now, because we were recently made aware of a video on TikTok. So guidelines on how to transport lions seem to be rather basic at this point. And this TikTok video we saw really raised some concerns about how problematic it is. So I want to show this video before we go into the questions. Right, we just have a lion strapped in a cage on the back of an open bakkie on the highway. So, Christine, I'd like to come to you first. What improvements have the transport protocols been suggesting? Could you go into that first?
Okay. Yeah, so the MTT transport protocols, it basically considers all aspects. So it starts already prior to the transport. So what needs to be considered already before you actually go to the animal and load it. So it takes those factors into consideration, starting from like permits, but also considering your vehicles, your means of transport, and also staff. Staff is a very important factor with these things, because you don't want anyone, you know, like the person should be experienced with transport, experienced with the animals, with the vehicle, and very important safety aspects. So when it comes to the crates, yes, so the animal, yes, should be transported in a crate. Safety is the uttermost priority, because as with this, you can't risk having an animal escape on the back of a bakkie, so to say. So the crates, there's very specifics on that. They need to be, yes, safe first, but then also should be as they're not going to be comfortable for an animal because it's still in a very small confined space, but they should take as much, they should provide as much comfort as possible. So meaning there is certain recommendation when it comes to water, when it comes to bedding, when it comes to also the animals' discharges, like your urine, your feces, that's not stays in there. Transport crates can have a bottom drawer so that the urine is just collected there, but the animal actually doesn't sit in it.
Yes.
You have to take ventilation and temperature into consideration. So it deals with all of those aspects. And this goes for road transport, but also for transport via planes.
You mentioned
Yeah.
in there that, lions shouldn't be able to escape buckies, but of course, last year we actually saw this happening. So, Louise, what other issues have you experienced relating to the lack of proper transport protocols in the industry? And maybe you could address the example that we saw happen last year.
Absolutely. I think part of the problem that we need to recognize is that in this industry, a lot of the lions are being bred in the Free States and hunted predominantly in the Northwest and Limpopo as well. So there's a lot of transport between those provinces. And as we know, the distances are considerable between those provinces. So transport of lions and other predators as well is a regular occurrence. And last year we saw that one lion somehow managed to bite, nibble, claw, we don't know, through its crate and escaped. It was later found by a farmer, a local farmer, who shot the animal. So often these sort of incidents then end up with the animal losing its life. A lot of stress involved, obviously, for the animal, but also safety concerns for people where the animal escapes. We've also regularly heard incidents where lions are just sedated, and then if it's a short transport from one local farm to another local farm, sedated, thrown at the back of a bakkie, sedation doesn't last long enough, and the animals escape from the back of a bakkie. So yes, there are, transport is being taken very laissez-faire, I think is the word, industry, creating safety issues for people, stress and safety and welfare issues for the animals as well.
Now, just watching that TikTok video, and it says, only in South Africa, and it's a bit of a laugh, and, people think, oh, where else in the world would you see this, right? And we, on the surface, think that it could be fairly funny, I guess, to see something like that happening. But Karen, what were you seeing there that immediately makes you concerned about the animal's welfare, but just the general conditions in which it's being transported?
I hope you can hear me because the signal is going quite badly. But, obviously, as Christine mentioned, when you transport an animal, you want it to be in a crate that keeps the animal secure and comfortable and prevents it from escaping and causing danger. But you have a large crate with a particularly large animal on the back of a smallish vehicle. It's exposed to the stress of the traffic. There are, in fact, the South African Bureau of Standards have some standards for the transport of carnivores. And those were put together quite comprehensively by a number of experts. But unfortunately, the South African Bureau of Standards, the SANS codes are voluntary, so they cannot be enforced. But there certainly are guidelines out there about the responsible transport of carnivores.
So just briefly, looking at
the prolonged period in that position is a problem. Lions will not urinate, will not defecate in a confined space. So very often those lions that are kept for prolonged periods will have bladder problems, will have constipation and impaction issues. So, and they'll be cramped and uncomfortable. So it needs to be a crate that can confine them safely, prevent them escaping, prevent the stress, and then also for as shortest period as possible. And as Christine said, making sure that they're not sitting in urine and feces and getting urine burn and things like that. With in a crate like that, I would be concerned.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to move on to the next protocol now, since we are slowly running out of time, unfortunately. The next protocol is about the keeping conditions and interactions with lions for tourism purposes. So there's some really good background on this. There was a recent study conducted by Four Paws that actually looked at YouTube videos that visitors themselves had posted in which they were interacting with captive predator cubs. And what this study demonstrated was that visitors are largely unaware of the welfare issues that captive animals are experiencing and may even misinterpret their behaviors. You know, we may think, for instance, that crying or pawing at something is cute, when in fact we're seeing distress behaviors. Now, most of the videos demonstrated these very cute interactions, but the researchers pointed out that there were several issues happening here. And I really think it is noteworthy again at this point to demonstrate that as the public, we are often unaware of what animals in genuinely good condition look like. And it shows us as well that there are still welfare issues in seemingly good public facilities that are very popular for visitors. And that highlights again why we need to be so concerned about facilities that aren't open to the public at all. So, Christine, when we see the footage that we're about to play of lion cubs being taken away from their mother, it really pulls at your heartstrings. But what are the underlying welfare issues associated with taking cubs away from their mothers this early on in their lives?
Yeah, so I think one has to differentiate between the psychological and the physical problems. I think what gets often forgotten is when you take them away from the mother, I mean, one can only imagine, yes, okay, it's an animal, but I mean, even for us, thinking of, how do I say this nicely? The stress that comes with that, like your mother gives you comfort, she provides nutrition, shelter, she teaches you everything, and then you get ripped off that, and that's get taken away, and you just be placed in the hands of humans. People touch you, random people, different smells. There's nothing comforting about this anymore. So just that stress and trauma, one can only imagine. So I think that's the one part of, that people forget. As you said before, they're all cute and, who doesn't want to like touch a lion cub, but people forget about that.
Yes.
And the second point is obviously the physical welfare, which comes with this. We have briefly touched on this before, but in that age is when normally, the immune system develops, they still get the antibodies from the mother. It's slowly and gradually, like they don't wean off from one day to another. It's a process. So meaning the immune system, especially like the intestines, would then be compromised, leaving them more at risk for diseases, parasites, which they cannot defend by themselves at this stage, or hardly. On this cub actually is one of the next problems with the musculoskeletal development. You can see how it leads to deformities.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of deformities actually quite known. I think that happens lots, especially when there's inadequate vitamins and minerals not provided in the food, in the milk. And once they, like when they're still very young, with good nutrition, one can make up for a lot. But the longer they don't get supplemented, the more severe the changes will be as the growth plates also close. And once it's like they're closed, there's not much one can do to make up for that. And then also in the long run, you'll see neurological problems with inadequate development there of the brain. Same with ataxia, gait problems within the spinal cord. So yeah, one can go on and on and on with these, unfortunately.
Karen, how widespread is this practice of removing cubs from their mothers at such a young age? Is this common across the country?
Sorry, I think I missed the last bit of your question, but I get the gist of it. Again, this is an industry that has changed and is constantly changing, and there have been trends and different patterns of behavior within the industry. Where there is cub petting, we are still seeing cubs removed regularly for volunteerism and for paying international volunteers to come and pay and play with those cubs. But interestingly, we have seen a split in the industry where there's the cub petting and the handling and the walking for tourism. And then there are some facilities that are doing ranched line where there's hands off completely. But we do know from studies, and I'm sure the task team will have seen this as well, that there is movement between the cub petting facilities where the cubs are moved and then walked and used for tourism and the hunting industries. So unfortunately, yes, it does still happen. And these cubs have a very rough time. As Christine pointed out, there are numerous welfare issues with long-term chronic health problems that affect their quality of life.
In this previous video we just saw now, there was actually a cub with a missing ear, which I believe can often come about because the cubs tend to obviously huddle together and they might suckle on each other's ears, and that leads to problems. And we actually saw over there that this cub lost its ear as a result of that. Louise, I'd like to know, how is this practice of raising cubs linked to tourism? Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, as Karen just said as well, a lot of these cubs are bred, taken away from their mothers at a young age, because it's only sort of the first 3 or 4 months that tourists can interact with them. It's a very short period of time because these animals, they grow up very quickly and become too large and boisterous to be interacting with tourists. So it's very much all part and parcel of this big sort of life cycle, and they're not all staying within one facility. They move around, as Karen was saying as well. They might be bred at one facility, then they might be either rented out or loaned or whatever to a tourism facility where they are being handled, whether for cub petting, for photo props, feeding, volunteerism, and there's lots of welfare issues. And one of the things that I would just like to add as well is what we've seen a lot in the tourism industry is that these cubs are actually handled for a very considerable duration of the day as well. You know, sometimes up to 7-8 hours a day, 7 days a week. These are they're young animals that should be playing, sleeping, developing in that way. They obviously need adults, they need their mother. They don't have that. this little tiger cub that we came across in a facility that is open to the public was actually held across from its mother. So the mother and the cub could see each other through the fencing. It was all on its own in a very barren enclosure, absolutely bored, very probably scared, stressed, playing with inappropriate means like pieces of fencing. So yeah, there is lots of issues, and inadvertently, often people don't realize they become part of the problem because they perpetuate that industry by interacting with these animals.
I remember that cub well. It was incredibly heartbreaking to hear the mother crying and then the cub responding, but just not being able to get close to each other. And like we see in the photo, she was playing with mesh. And that was really about the only thing that there was for her in that enclosure. I remember being particularly heartbroken at that site. So I'd like to move on to wider welfare issues in these facilities that are open to the public. They're open to paying tourists. Now, many of us who visit these exhibition facilities around South Africa that display big cats, we don't really get to see the more nuanced welfare issues, right? We know when we can see something really extreme and something that really is concerning, but we're not always aware of something that's maybe a bit more subtle, but still severe for the animal. So Karen, I'd like to come back to you and ask, what are the kinds of welfare issues that people can expect to find at such facilities? And really focus for me on the idea that we're talking about public facilities open to tourists, not just the ones that are hidden for skeleton trade or for cat hunting.
Here we go again. Put the
Don't
brain
worry,
back
we're
in.
going to always be doing this.
It's one of those nights, been one of those days. I think we've covered quite extensively what people are seeing at the various facilities in terms of welfare. But I think what is equally concerning for us is what happens behind the scenes at the facilities that are not open to the public. Because there are some members of the public, thank goodness, who are aware of the issues and who do raise concerns. And that is how complaints are brought through to welfare organizations, and the public are alerted to what is going on. It's very often the practices that are behind the scenes, and that as animal welfare inspectors you see that are deeply concerning. And just one of the practices that we saw on a farm in the Free State, there were two farms. The lion are held long-term, and they're held in completely substandard condition with absolute minimal feeding, very underweight, very poor conditions, crammed into cages, and then a hunt is booked, and then the lion are moved. Intensive feeding and intensive fattening up, and then they are ready for the hunt. So I think it's not just the welfare that we're seeing in the public facilities, but the welfare that is going on behind the scenes as well. Carnivores and lion and tigers, which we're seeing in most of these facilities, are very large apex predators. They have complex social lives and private lives, and they have territories. And, you know, if you compare the size of a lion and what he encounters on a daily basis in his normal life, the size of his home range, the complexity of what he's exposed to, and then you compare it to putting it into a small cage. We cannot possibly provide adequately for animals like lion and the large apex predators in a captive situation. You know, if you compare it to something like a little mouse, you can provide in a captive situation everything that he would need, space-wise, what he's going to encounter food-wise. But with apex predators and animals like elephants, it's very, very difficult to provide in captivity for them. And as was mentioned earlier, there have been a number of studies done, scientific studies, that show that large cats in captivity experience a large number of health problems. And And we're certainly seeing that in the captive population.
And I know from experience, some of the things that we've seen on the ground that the public may not be aware of, that our stress behaviors would be like this lion now that's just pacing up and down a fence. You know, those kind of stereotypic behaviors of pacing. In the previous video, I wonder if we could go back there a second with the leopards. Just wait to see if it comes up on the screen. Here, we see 3 leopards in an enclosure in which you can literally see all 3 sides of it. It's tiny, and there's 3 leopards in there. Is that species appropriate to be seeing 3 leopards in such a small space?
Again, going back to the fact that these are territorial animals that hold territories, that fight to defend their territories, that have very large home ranges, and in the wild will move over quite an extensive distance during their daily life. To then confine 3 animals to a small cage, you have the stress. They not getting adequate exercise. There are just so many factors that make this a significant welfare concern.
Thank you. Louise, I would like to come to you now. I just want to ask about the educational justification for these facilities. Many of them justify their existence on the idea that they provide education. So how can you respond to that?
Yeah, I think we hear that quite a lot, and the video that is being played here was a really good example, where the guide was actually telling us that this sub-adult male virtually has no mane, had a lot of hair loss, so obviously suffering from some kind of parasites, infestation, and I just asked the blunt question, as you do, so what's wrong with this lion? Why doesn't he have a mane? And basically the story that he was telling us, that it's the lesser maned lion, because there's 6 different lion species, 2 which are probably extinct, but this was part of the lesser maned lion. So, sometimes it's the very poor information that is being given, a blatantly incorrect information. So the educational value is obviously inadequate. And I think there's, if we could also maybe sort of look at the next video, Geordie, the one with the warthog and the leopards, it's teaching our children that it's okay to have, so there's warthogs on the right-hand side of this enclosure. On the left-hand side, there is the leopards. Now, it must be incredibly stressful to have, your predator and your prey species right next to each other. So what are we teaching our children? We're just sticking random animals in enclosures, wild animals that, as Karen was saying, have very complex needs. We even mix up species that live on different continents, like lions and tigers. We even hybridize them, we even breed a cross between a lion and a tiger. So all these examples are just showing that the educational value is lacking, to say the least. And I think what we could say, there might be some edutainment in these things. And this is another example, what are we teaching our children by showing them wild dogs in a completely barren enclosure? There's nothing here, there's a piece of shades, and that's it. So what is the educational value in those kind of examples? It's very limited.
Absolutely. And I mean, I have to say, even if there was, hypothetically speaking, a board up that listed the species, their range, maybe a bit of behavior, I still struggle to understand how that provides real value anyway, even if there were a small piece of educational material. Now, unfortunately, we are quickly reaching the end. So I'm going to slowly wrap up this webinar, and I'm going to end by asking in general. Now, let's start with you, Louise, but I'd like to open it up to Christine and Karen as well. With the intent of the government to ultimately close this captive industry, we all want to see as many lions as possible being rehomed to true sanctuaries, or as the MTT has been calling them, lion safe havens. How many lions can realistically, though, be rehomed?
Yeah, I can certainly respond to that, because we did a lot of work. We spoke to all the true sanctuaries or lion safe havens in South Africa, and there are very, very few. There's about 30 spaces, sort of quite quickly, and with financial injections, maybe another 170 spaces around all the lion safe havens in South Africa. So we're looking at a maximum of maybe 200 lions that we can rehome. We have to always consider the financial sustainability of these facilities as well, because you can't just take on more and more lions, because it is expensive to provide a lifetime care for lions. So they have to be financially sustainable in order to responsibly rehome animals in sanctuaries and provide a home until the end of their lifetime, their natural life. So the financial sustainability is very important, because if that doesn't exist, then they cannot guarantee the welfare of the animals, and they can't maintain the high welfare standards that they should in those lion safe havens. And I think as soon as the financial situation becomes an issue, then it means that often welfare standards start dropping. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Christine, Karen, is there anything that you would like to add to that before we move on to the Q&A?
I think Louise has covered it pretty well, that at the end it does come down to finances. Because it should have a long-term effect. It doesn't help if one can take an animal in and then half a year down the line they can't provide adequate food or care for it anymore. And the same goes, I think, for qualified staff. Like, you don't want anyone looking after your lions. You want people with, which are qualified, which have the experience, which have seen this and certain conditions and know their animals.
Thank you. Karen, anything from your side?
I think we've covered a lot in this discussion, and I just want to end on a positive note.
Yes, please.
And just say that I think the new policy directions, the policy position, the outcome of the high-level panel, Ministerial Task Team, there's so many positive developments happening, the inclusion of the NEMLA Wellbeing Clause, and really as the welfare and the conservation community, we just have to keep pushing for the right things to happen, because South Africa does have a really good conservation reputation. And industries like this and the things that we've seen on the slides and what we're seeing on inspections are what we don't need. Yes. So on the positive side, there are some good moves.
I couldn't agree more. We honestly have one of the most incredibly beautiful countries. We don't need this. This doesn't provide any value to our country, and we have so many beautiful ways of being able to experience wildlife that don't look like this. That's, I think, really what it boils down to as well, is that this isn't a life, this isn't fair for the animals. So I'd like to move to the Q&A. Lisa has asked us, with all the awareness campaigns that we've been doing, especially regarding responsible tourism. So I'm going to aim this one at you, Louise. With volunteer programs and those types of things, have we started seeing a decrease in cub petting and walking with lions?
I think there has been a slight decrease, certainly in terms of walking with lions type of activities. I think volunteers are also more aware. They're more sort of savvy about the kind of places that they should be responsibly visiting, those that they're not. They're probably a little bit more aware because of awareness campaigns, the questions that they should ask. So yes, I think we are seeing an improvement, but it is still quite surprising how many people are totally unaware and are unaware when they are going to a cub petting facility that they are part of the problem and that they are perpetuating this industry and that these animals are not being released into the wild and live out a happy life, and that these cubs are not orphaned, or all the various stories that we hear. So yes, there is some improvement. On the other flip side, it's still very surprising how many people are very unaware of the issues.
And I think it's important to note that cub petting facilities are obviously a big red flag, but at the same time, commercial keeping facilities, even without the cub petting, are still not ideal situations for these captive animals. So even just the absence of cub petting is not necessarily a green flag either. The next question comes from Catherine Pretorius. What is to happen to facilities that have not agreed to surrender? Who would like to take that question? I know that's a big one.
I'm happy to start with that one. So at the moment, we are in a situation where voluntary exit is an option. It's voluntary. So people can still continue with their operations. Currently, that is still legal in South Africa. The keeping and breeding for commercial purposes of lions is in every aspect still a legal activity. So people can, for the moment, still continue until certain pieces of legislation may come into place. So voluntary exits is a possibility, is an opportunity for people. It's a way out, but yeah, continuing with the industry, with the business is fully legal. I was going to add something else, and that has gone straight out of my... Oh yes, the one thing that has I think it has come in place now is there is a prohibition notice on the permitting of new facilities. Okay. So new entrants to the industry, there is a prohibition on that, but anybody was already part of the industry can continue.
Now, two euthanasia questions, which I both think are very important. Karen, I'd like to ask you the first one. For any lions that need to be euthanized, would the facility owner be held accountable if the reason for that euthanasia is due to obvious signs of cruelty, abuse, or neglect? What would happen in those cases to the facility owner? Oh no, I hope we haven't lost Karen.
My signals.
There you are.
Oh, am I here now? Sorry, my signal is really bad. I missed that question. If somebody else could pick it up so we don't waste time on that one.
No problem. Christine or Louise, would you like to answer that?
Apologies.
I'm happy to start, and Christine, just interrupt or add if you want to. So yes, somebody can be held responsible and accountable for the lack of quality, of the lack of health, or whatever it is, the reasons why this animal needs to be euthanized, and they can be prosecuted under the Animals Protection Act for that. As a MTT, we have looked at the possibility of looking at amnesty, and that is a potential possibility as well. But Karen, if you can hear us and you want to add anything, there is definitely, you know, when there are serious and cruel and situations of abuse and neglect, somebody can be prosecuted under the APA.
That's okay, Karen. Christine, I wonder if you could clarify who's paying for the euthanasia. I mean, euthanasia isn't necessarily the cheapest option. Christine or Louise, who would be paying for that euthanasia then? Louise, what are your thoughts?
That is a very good question. One that hasn't really been resolved. We have been looking at funding, and there is some money available to help this process of voluntary exit. However, some of the donors have stipulated that they don't want to pay for euthanasia. So that is a little bit of a gray area. And I couldn't give a completely straight answer to that, because we weren't actually able to take people through the process of voluntary exit until the minister had approved the various exit options and the protocols that have now also been approved by cabinet. So yeah, that whole process is ongoing, and who pays for euthanasia is a very sort of it's a difficult one. As I say, some of the external third-party funders, you know, nobody really likes to be funding euthanasia. So yeah, not quite clear.
So Nicholas asks a question that I think we somewhat addressed actually in the last webinar regarding how do we decide which lions can be saved. Now, my understanding is that part of the MTT report was also a welfare assessment that could be conducted to decide on the quality of life of the animals currently in captivity. Is that correct? How many lions do we know, more or less? Can we estimate how many lions need to be euthanized currently? Or is that just too big a question at this point?
That's a massive big question, and that's the million-dollar question that everybody wants to know. We have no idea.
Yeah.
How many animals, if you take, and I don't know, Christine, if you would want to take a guess, but you know, we've worked on the quality of life assessment together, and yeah, it doesn't take a lot of scoring points before you get to a state where the quality of life of the animal can no longer be guaranteed, unless maybe expensive treatment is going to be part of that. How many animals are in that kind of situation? It's everybody's guess, and I wouldn't dare to even take a stab at it.
Yeah, I think it's just really important to understand that this industry has only very recently undergone this level of scrutiny, and that was part of what the MTT was trying to achieve. So even through our own research, I know how we struggled to get an understanding of just how many animals are in captivity. So to estimate the number of animals that would need to be euthanized also means that we need manpower on the ground to conduct these assessments, or these welfare assessments. And that is something that obviously will become priority at some point, but to actually make that estimation now would be near impossible because it's never undergone this level of scrutiny before. I would like to wrap up the discussion here with just one more comment, really, from the chat section, which I feel is quite important to address. And after that, unfortunately, we may have to address all other questions via email. But Jack, I see that you believe that this meeting is a bit of a disappointment, and I'm sorry to hear that. But we all, you say here that we all know about, if we're in conservation, we know about this issue, and why aren't there any legislative efforts happening to ban these wildlife farms? Well, I feel like that was the point of the MTT. Perhaps Louise, Christine, and Karen, you could clarify Jack's concerns there about what the legislative process entails and what we are working for.
Yeah, I think the obviously the HLP kind of started this whole process. The government has made an intent to close down the industry. We have all the reasons behind this, why it should be closed down, but to actually change legislation, and Karen, if you want to add anything here, please do, to actually change a legal industry that has been allowed to function for, what, 3 decades, is not that easy to just ban overnight. And to change legislation takes time because it needs to go through all the processes that are stipulated in our constitution and in our whole governance of our country. So to actually change legislation is going to take at least a couple of years' time to do so. In the meantime, this industry remains legal. So these efforts are happening. They're just very slow. And it's just baby steps towards this longer term objective of ultimately closing this industry. And please, Karen, do add if you feel that there's...
Louise, I think you covered it. I think the Minister of Environment, Minister Creasy, and her department have taken a very systematic approach to the changing of the legislation. And we now have a white paper, which is overarching a guiding policy. We have a policy position. We've had the high-level panel recommendations. There's been a review of certain of the legislation. There's the National Biodiversity Economy Strategy. There's a new NEMBA bill, thematic review of legislation and change of legislation. But as you say, it has to go through the processes. It's got to be done with stakeholder participation. It's got to be done with public consultation. It has to go through cabinet approval. It's a huge thing to try and change legislation. And then whilst we have a constitution that is really, really good and allows for certain rights, the constitution also makes it very difficult from an animal welfare perspective, because animals are viewed as property. So it does present challenges. So whilst there are a lot of positive steps, there's also a lot of need for welfare and well-being to be looked at, and to provide legislation and regulation that supports that.
Thank you so much. We have gone a little bit over time, so I feel like we need to wrap up the conversation here. I would like to invite anyone in the audience, though, if there are things that we haven't addressed, if there are questions or concerns you still have, you are always welcome to contact us. You can contact the info@bloodlions.org email address, and we will happily continue to answer these questions. We all feel very strongly, in fact, about making sure that we're disseminating the most factual and the most accurate information about this closure and about the concerns with the industry. So please do feel free to get in touch with us if there is anything that we have left out or you would still like answered. And I just want to extend a thank you to Louise, to Christine, to Karen. Thank you so much for everything that you have been doing. Everything that you have been doing. And thank you so much for your time tonight. We really do appreciate it. And I feel like we've been given so much information to process and to be thinking about.
Thank you. Yes, if in a closing remark, maybe I can just say that, you know, Minister Creasy has also been given a legacy. When she came into her department, into her ministry, this industry was already existing and had sort of reached its peak. So I think it is a little bit, it's not quite fair to say that Minister Creasy is useless. I think she has tried very hard, and she's very committed to closing this industry. But she was given a huge legacy of an industry that had already existed for many, many years. So yeah, that was just a closing comment in response to one of the comments in the chat box.
No, it's certainly important. The industry is a growing one, and it is, like we've always said, continuously in flux. She was handed an enormous task, and it was already a burgeoning industry when she stepped in. So we are already looking at all her efforts and grateful for the fact that we have reached this point. So thank you very much to everyone who has attended. Thank you so much, ladies, for all your time and effort. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from the audience if there's anything else. We'll be posting this to YouTube soon, so you are welcome to also have a look over there. Thank you and have a good evening, everyone.